Now, I'm sure many of you have been following the campaign rallies being held by the political parties across Nigeria. 2 months after the official start of the campaign season, the pace is accelerating and the parties are steadily bringing out their weapons of war. We haven't seen much door-to-door canvassing yet. It appears to be mostly big rallies held in state capitals with party bigwigs joining their presidential candidates to speak mostly to the party faithful and others who attend out of curiosity, boredom, or perhaps because they've been paid to attend. But do these rallies actually make any difference with the electorate? Do they help to garner votes for the parties? Or are they just a travelling amusement show, a sort of carnival of merrymaking and revelry aimed at rewarding state chapters that have been fastidious in their support? Well, the respected think tank, the Center for Democracy and Development, or CDD, has long studied election campaigns and what makes them successful or not. Their senior fellow is the noted psephologist, Professor Jibrin Ibrahim, and he joins me now in the studio. And for those who don't know, a psephologist is someone who studies elections. Very honoured, as always, to have you, Professor. First of all, give us your assessment of the current state of the campaigns as we enter the third month of those campaigns.
I think the first point to make about campaigns are that there are candidates campaigning with a purpose of hoping to win the elections, and there are candidates who are campaigning with the purpose of getting noticed for maybe a greater tomorrow. So in this campaign, there are 18 presidential candidates, for example, 4 of which take their campaign seriously, think they have a chance, and are campaigning for power. The others simply want to get noticed. Maybe if they get noticed next time round, they'll have a chance. Or maybe it's a negotiating position if opportunities present themselves. This means for these two groups, the campaign tactics are different. For those who are not serious contenders, they simply want to rely on, for example, the TV interviews or organized debates where they'll get a chance to get noticed. While for the top 4, they have the resources and they have what they call the structures to try to make their impact felt in the campaign. The second point about campaign is, what do you do at each part of the campaign? We are in the very first phase of this campaign. And the primary purpose of the campaigners at this stage is to make sure they can make a demonstration of strength, to show they have presence, to show they can raise a big crowd, to show that, yes, they are in this race. And that's why, as you have mentioned, the focus has really been on rallies. And rallies are very interesting in the sense that they are extremely costly to organize. It involves a lot of traveling, bringing supporters. Most of those supporters that come have transport provided, meals provided, and some little money. So these can be very expensive when you are bringing tens of thousands of people. But in Nigerian campaign, it is considered that if you cannot do that in the first phase, then you are not really considered a contender. So it's really showing your credentials. Look at my certificate. I went to primary school and I have a primary school certificate. So that's the first phase 1 of the campaign, which is ongoing now.
Well, let me ask you on that point, and by the way, that's a brilliant analysis. Looking at those carnival type rallies that you said we see happening across the country, how much are they contributors to success?
Well, they simply show your presence. It is not the core of the campaign. Let me make a general point. In general, you don't win an election just because you have campaigned. You win an election because you have more supporters than the others. And for most of the supporters who will vote for you in elections, you don't actually have to campaign to them because they support you anyway, would vote for you anyway. And
although
therefore,
you've got undecided voters and
yes,
so on.
I know that's, but that's not the large group.
Right.
For most candidates, the bulk of their voters will be people who will vote for them anyway, whether or not you campaign towards them. So in a sense, campaigns are designed to address the others, those who are undecided, those who you think you can bring to your position. And that's why in these campaigns, there are two things that happen. One, you show I'm strong, I'm capable, I'm competent. Two, my opponent is weak, is old, is incapable. Therefore, my opponent is a risk to you, while I'm a positive force for your future. And that's what I'm trying to show you. That's what I'm trying to convince you about. So these elements of campaigns vis-a-vis the votes obtained in elections themselves, we always need to be careful. It's not the campaign that produces the bulk of your votes. The bulk of your votes are already secured because of the support you have. And there are very many reasons why you may have support. It can be beauty, it can be financial resources, it could be ethnic or religious persuasion, could be anything that makes some voters find you attractive and therefore somebody to vote for.
Very interesting. So is there any way at this stage that we can measure which of the candidates appears to be dominating so far on the campaign trail?
I think it's very difficult to approach it that way. One way to approach it for me is that some candidates appear very frightened of debating with others, and therefore are doing everything to avoid a debate, a confrontation of ideas, to avoid answering questions. And that's a signifier of a very profound weakness of some of those candidates.
But isn't that also a political strategy in this election? I mean, if you know what your weak points are, you try to avoid getting into that sort of pothole, if you like.
Exactly. It's really very important. If you feel you are going to fail, as it were, in a public debate, avoid that public debate, because you don't want your weaknesses to come to the forefront. You want to pretend all you have are strengths, capabilities, and positive force that will bring you to
But I mean,
success.
we've seen people in the past who avoid those debates but still end up winning the elections.
Yes, they do, but I think the issue now is a bit different in the sense that a lot of Nigerians are questioning why some people are avoiding debates and confrontation. We now live in a world of the social media and the presence of cameras in every corner. Therefore, the types of gaffe people are afraid of making and therefore being seen, people are seeing anyway and are reaching conclusions. Now we understand why he doesn't want a debate or a confrontation, because he can't even talk coherently. So what could have been an advantage previously may now turn out to be a disadvantage, because people are reaching conclusions that there are issues of concern of why some of those candidates are avoiding debate and confrontation.
That's very interesting. But the one thing that I would imagine that no one can shy away from is the issue of money. Which of the front runners do you see as being flush with cash? Which is facing tough budgetary decisions? Who's doing well with fundraising?
I think there's very little fundraising that occurs in Nigeria's election, which is to say massive amounts of money are spent in elections, but these are not fundraised in the way in which monies are raised in normal democracies.
It's not a crowdfunding thing,
no.
basically.
So essentially what happens is a lot of the money for elections come from government sources. So those who have the most money are those who have the president and most of the governors, because these are the sources of government money that are siphoned off and used for campaigns. So it's quite easy to work out who has money. I think some of the candidates do have personal fortunes, but the story I hear in the streets is that for those who have been out of power for 10, 15 years, even if they have had a large personal fortune at some point in their life, they've been spending that money over time, and that personal fortune may have declined considerably over the period. I think one thing exciting about this election, which was also exciting, I think, about the 2015 elections, is that certain candidates who are charismatic are able to get ordinary people to fundraise for them or to spend on their behalf. That happened a lot with President Buhari in 2015, and a lot of that is happening with Peter Obi today. People feel these are strong, charismatic individuals who have a purpose, and therefore they are, as it were, cutting off from the tradition, which is that only those contestants spend money and the people simply follow and demand for their share of the money. But when they are really motivated by specific candidates, they feel it is worthwhile, it makes sense for them to put their own money in line. So one of the things that we're going to see as this campaign progresses is whether some of those candidates with charisma are able to generate substantial finances that would make a difference vis-a-vis those who are able to directly access government resources.
Yes, that would be the ultimate test, wouldn't it? And in terms of the campaigns themselves, who in your assessment is putting on the most positive face and is perhaps traveling the country more? I mean, who's getting their message out there is what I mean. Or are they all doing it successfully?
Well, I think, campaigns are based on a basic document, which is the manifesto of the candidate, which is supposed to circulate massively and which is supposed to generate debates among voters. But in this country, manifestos of candidates hardly ever get seen, hardly ever get debated. And in my own profession, I have to read some of these manifestos to know what is the content of their program. And a lot of them are very well written. A lot of them actually make all the good arguments. And you find that in essence, a lot of them are making the same argument. So maybe at the end of the day, it's not a very useful document because there's now a tradition where you get the best consultants in the country to sit down and write your manifesto, which is a travesty of the whole essence of democracy. Because your manifesto is supposed to emanate from the concerns of your party members, and you are supposed to consult party members from the ward level right up to the national level, get their concerns and synthesize them in terms of your manifesto.
And it's supposed to be driven by the ideological leanings of the party as well.
Exactly. Yeah. And we are not seeing a lot of that. Although Nigeria is in a very strange place on that question, because we are one of the few countries in the world where all parties are directed to formulate their manifestos on the basis of Chapter 2 of the Constitution, which, as you know, has a very clear paradigm of state control of the economy and the provision of services. So the Constitution says all parties should draw their manifestos from Chapter 2 of the Constitution, which reduces the freedom of parties to articulate themselves. But what we have seen is that parties, when you look at the PDP under Obasanjo, for example, they demolished, really, in essence, Chapter 2 of the Constitution by privatizing everything that they could put their hands on, while the Constitution says, no, we want government control of what they call the commanding heights of the economy. So my first point is, therefore, manifestos should be decisive in campaigns. However, we know they are not. The second issue is rallies. How useful are what they say in rallies? The problem with rallies is that the message in each rally is determined by the venue. People look at what are the issues around that venue and zero in on those specific issues so that they are convincing to the majority of the audience they are addressing, and therefore doesn't give a good picture of their national position. And for you to work out their national position, you have to follow what they say in different rallies. And when you do that, as the CDD did in 2015, where they followed all the promises President Buhari made in various rallies, and when they compiled them, President Buhari was himself shocked that I said all these things all over. Then he denied it. I said, no, I couldn't have said all these things. So that's really a statement about how serious are the things said in rallies.
That's a very good point. And beyond the rallies, because as you correctly pointed out, you've got to be able to afford those rallies to actually hold them. From the point of view of the newer parties, things like social media and technology look very promising, and there's a lot of talk about how the older parties will not be able to sustain themselves, but then in the end they do, and we saw it nationally in 2019 and most recently in Osun, Edo, Ekiti. It was the older parties that won. So are the comparative efforts at looking at this missing the changes that have happened not just on technology, but in the strategy of the older, more dominant parties?
Well, what has happened is that there was an initial advantage for the newer parties that was strong in the social media. But the older and richer parties realized very early on that that's really a very important instrument. And they learned to utilize it. And they learn to utilize it in the way in which they normally operate. When you take WhatsApp, for example, which is one of the most important elements of the social media in campaigning, what some of the studies we have done shown is that these parties have set up huge teams in every state who essentially buy into WhatsApp groups. They have a large budget and then are able to spread the messages they want to spread systematically through those WhatsApp groups, and therefore tend to show preponderant presence that may not in reality be there. For other elements of the social media, such as Facebook and Twitter, of course, they are also buying bots. These are automated message systems. which send out tens of thousands of messages pretending to come from human beings, while these are simply machine producing message. So those who have had a lot of strength in the social media still have their presence, but these others are able to encroach considerably.
But could you also argue that for parties, for instance, like the Labour Party, which relies a lot on technology, that social media allows their supporters to connect with each other without necessarily needing those kind of big physical rallies, etc., per se? Or should we not assume that just because they can communicate on social media, they acquire some sort of advantage?
No, I think there's no doubt that their presence on the social media has been an advantage for them. And it has been a big tool in terms of political mobilization, in terms of fundraising, in terms of spreading messages, in terms of countering fake and false news, which is now a very essential part of the campaign, because people send all sorts of false messages to bring down their opponents. So the capacity of their opponents to show that those messages, the content of those messages are fake, is a very important part of that ability to campaign. I think it's very unfortunate that we are beginning to learn in this country some of what the Americans call negative campaigning, where you try to heap insults and attacks on your opponents rather than try to sell your own message of what you can produce, about what difference you can make. And I feel that really attack ads in particular, they undermine the sanity of the campaign processes, and it's something that really should be discouraged in our society.
I want to thank you very much indeed, Prof. It's always absolutely hugely beneficial. Now I understand why they call you a psephologist, because you really understand these things, and we appreciate the way that you explain it, and it really helps the audience to get a better grasp of the way things are going. Professor Jibrin Ibrahim is a senior fellow at the Center for Democracy and Development. Thank you very much indeed.
Always a pleasure.